At about the time that Ford Madox Brown was working on this portrait of a Welsh industrialist and millionaire, another artist of a very different calibre was painting a young woman in his Paris studio. The artist was Pierre-Auguste Renoir. His model was an actress, Henriette Henriot. Of her we know little, except that she met a tragically early death while trying to rescue her pet dog from a fire at her theatre. And between the wealth created by that Welsh industrialist and this masterpiece of French art, there is a curious if tenuous connection, for because of that wealth, Renoir's Blue Lady, as she is called, has found a worthy resting place here at the National Museum of Wales. The Renoir is the centrepiece of a collection of paintings and sculpture that represents the whole spectrum of 19th century French art. It ranges from realists such as Daumier and Millet to the great impressionists and post-impressionists like Paul Cézanne, for example, with this still life painted in 1899, and Manet's Argenté. But it was in the early years of this century that these works were first bought by two Welsh collectors. They were two sisters, Gwendolyn Elizabeth Davies and Margaret Sidney Davies, granddaughters of that Victorian industrialist. And it was these Davies Sisters of Gregynog who made this munificent bequest to the museum and to the nation. In a sense, this outstanding collection is the climax of the story. But it begins in mid-Wales, when David Davies was born in Llandinam in 1818. He was the eldest child and grew up here at the family farm of Draen Tewion. With little formal education, he left the village school at 11, and with his father worked as a sawyer of wood for the district, becoming known as Top Sawyer, a name he was proud to carry all his days. He became a civil engineer, and here at Llandinam Bridge, his statue by Alfred Gilbert now looks down over his first enterprise. These were the days when the railway first came to mid-Wales, and David Davies contracted for the line that eventually ran from Newtown to Machynlleth. The immensely deep cutting at Talerdig, here in Stovepipe Hat he directs the work, was but one of the many obstacles he overcame. That was in 1862. 2 years after the cutting at Talerdig was completed, Top Sawyer built himself a spacious home at Llandinam, a house which he called Bron Eirion. The place still stands, but it's now put to very different use as the county headquarters for the Girl Guides of Wales. But the site of the house was deliberately chosen. As he explained, it was near the station at Llandinam. From its windows, he could look across to his birthplace on the opposite hills, and it was near the chapel where he worshipped in the Calvinistic Methodist faith. At about the same time, this restless entrepreneur had already turned his attention to the mineral wealth of South Wales. In the next 20 years, David Davies and Company sank pit after pit in the valleys, pits with still remembered names, Park and Marty, Dare and Bullfa and the Lady Windsor. His Ocean Coal Company was formed in 1887 with David Davies and his son Edward holding nearly half the capital. Despite numerous strikes and increasing bitterness amongst the South Wales colliers generally, his workforce remained, for the most part, loyal. In that harsh Victorian climate of work, he was a better and more respected owner than most. The name of the Ocean Company was known worldwide, but the Bute Estate and the Taff Vale Railway had long held a stranglehold on the coal traffic to Cardiff docks, and breaking this monopoly was David Davies's last great achievement. He built a new railway from Porth and a dock system at Barry. From these docks, exports were soon running at 5 million tons a year. Now that trade has gone, and only his statue gazes blindly out over a vanished enterprise. When he died in 1890, a local newspaper obituary claimed that he rang true and clung to his own people, to his own place and faith, and to his own ideals. His son Edward was of a quieter, more introspective nature, with a great sense of honesty and justice. He would have been happier as an academic than as a leader of industry. His first wife died when his 3 children, David, Gwen and Margaret, were still quite young. He then married again. The children found their stepmother to be a strict disciplinarian and firmly religious. In contrast with today's cheerful and carefree descendants at Plas Dinam, they took everything seriously. There were, of course, the country pursuits and sports of the social scene, but always there was a religious note in their upbringing. They and their parents were regular worshippers here at the Methodist Chapel of Llandinam, where for 40 years the minister was the Reverend Richard Jones. His son, T. Mervyn Jones, remembers his own childhood attendance there on Sundays.
This is the Presbyterian Welsh Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, Llandinam. But I would come as a boy, and I think it's a very fine one, but I'm biased because it was our home chapel, and father, of course, was the minister.
And where would the Davies family have sat at that time?
They'd have sat here, Mrs. Edward Davies, Miss Gwenny, and then Miss Daisy.
Gwen was a keen amateur musician. Indeed, she owned a fine Stradivarius violin and often played the chapel organ.
She was much involved in bringing in Walford Davies here to Llandinam when he left the RAF, and founding the chair of music. And Walford Davies would sit in the pew there with them on many occasions. On some occasions he turned over the whole congregation to get them singing with him.
The sisters were sent to boarding school at Hendon, but they also had a governess at Plas Dinam. Jane Blaker was a forceful and cultured companion, more worldly than their stepmother, but equally a dominant influence. It was their governess who introduced her brother, Hugh Blaker, painter, actor, critic and art dealer. He met the sisters in 1908 and began buying pictures on their behalf, often at what seem to us now to be bargain prices. But apart from Blaker's advice and enthusiasm, what prompted these retiring ladies, far from the art world of London and the studios of Paris, to start collecting? Was it merely a simple liking for pictorial art? At any rate, their early purchases were conventional enough, like this Corot landscape of fishermen moored to a riverbank, and Millet's painting of the peasant family. Art expert Peter Cannon-Brooks explains his view of their collecting.
Well, my personal opinion is that the sisters originally had a slightly dilettante interest in art, as well-brought-up young ladies of the time were expected to. But under the influence of Hugh Blaker, who was the brother of their governess, they developed a much more closely defined interest in art. And first of all, they started to buy watercolors, and then a couple of years later to buy works by Turner and by Corot, and very rapidly, by 1912, they had emerged as important collectors. One of the curious things about this period is that the collecting of French painting of the 19th century is almost entirely confined to the Celtic fringe. The Davies sisters in South Wales, to Sir Hugh Lane in Dublin, and to a group of collectors in Glasgow. This is very odd. Now, a great deal has been said about the influence of Hugh Blaker on the collecting of the Davies sisters throughout the period of their artistic career. Because you've got to remember that they started collecting seriously in about, shall we say, 1908, and they virtually stopped dead in 1920. And I think that Blaker's influence has been greatly overrated.
As their excellent collection grew, so their tastes widened to include pictures such as this, the Tin Mug by the symbolist painter Carrière, and this Rain at Auvers by Vincent van Gogh, as well as Corot's view of Castel Gandolfo. But these were still for private viewing only, at home in Place d'Inam. It was not until 1913 that they were first exhibited publicly.
An interesting story, because apparently there was Murray Urquhart had been asked as an artist to go to Place d'Inam, as it was then, to paint the horses and the hounds. And he saw these pictures, it says 1912, he saw these pictures for the first time and was surprised, delighted, and wondered why the pictures weren't in fact seen by many more people. So, and it happened that Tom Jones Romney was there at that dinner that night, and apparently Tom went out and asked the two sisters whether they would consider an exhibition. Because the National Museum had recently been created, they had, by 1912, got a gallery in the City Hall for short-term temporary exhibitions, and the sisters said yes. And that was the first, 1913, early 1913, 6 weeks when their first pictures and the pictures of some of their friends were lent anonymously to the National Museum, and it was the National Museum's first major exhibition. The impact was quite spectacular, in the sense that large numbers of people went, that there was a considerable publicity in papers, both national and local.
It had very mixed reception indeed. There was a great deal of criticism of some of the French paintings because they were insufficiently finished. This was a very old-fashioned view of art, one which had been fought hard by critics and buyers like Sir Hugh Lane, who was then director of the National Gallery of Ireland. But that was one of the main criticisms. But generally, it was received well. It wasn't until slightly later that there was a great deal of controversy over, for example, the Cézanne paintings. It took nearly a year's correspondence in the columns of the Times before the Tate Gallery was persuaded to borrow from the Davies the Étretat Cézanne, which became the first Cézanne painting to be displayed in a public gallery in this country.
The coming of the First World War halted the collecting of pictures. It was to France that Gwen felt their patriotic duty and concern led them both, to help in caring for the Allied forces behind the lines.
And she offered her services very early on. But the French, everybody had conscription, so why worry, you know? They couldn't see why you had to have coffee or pictures at night or anything, so they thought she was daft and they didn't agree. She kept at it. She had given large sums of money, I may add, to the British lines, but they were the two sisters who shunned publicity. They've often been spoken of as shy. I don't think I would call it exactly shy. It was another quality. They shunned publicity. Indeed, perhaps you and I would if we had $1 million each. I've never had it, so I can't tell you, but, you know, they did shun it. So she wanted to go to France. Well, indeed, they gave in. They thought, if this silly Welsh woman wants to spend her money on us, why should we stop her? So she had her wish. And she had a canteen in Troyes, the nearest place to Verdun, where all the worst wounded came. We were all duly injected and dressed up as French Red Cross and so on, and went. And I spent the whole winter out in this place.
The rigours of life near the front in France were a far cry from their sheltered existence at Place d'Inam. But almost for the first time they were able to be themselves and, to a degree, to be liberated. Their earlier work for the rescue and rehabilitation of artists from an invaded Belgium was recognised by a medal from the Belgian government. And now a new idea began to take form and substance, the dream of a mansion in Wales that should become a centre for craftsmen. Possibly it was the lively inspiration of their friend and fellow relief worker at Troyes, Dora Herbert Jones, which first prompted that idea. Their brother, later the First Lord Davies, was himself an ardent promoter of worthy causes, such as the opening of a chest hospital here at Machynlleth. The family used some of their considerable wealth in helping people, not only by their lavish donations to worthy Welsh causes, social and charitable, but in a more direct and visible fashion. To this end, the two sisters decided to pursue their idea of a craft centre in mid-Wales. Gregynog Hall stands a few miles outside Newtown in Powys. This is no ancient mansion. Indeed, the house as we see it now dates only from the middle of the last century, when it was rebuilt almost entirely on the foundations of a much older building. In 1914, the owner, Lord Joycey, sold a large part of the estate to David Davies of Plas Dinam, grandson of Top Sawyer Davies. In 1920, the house and the grounds became the property of his two sisters. Thus, Gwendolen and Margaret Davies came to the place that they were to make celebrated as never before in its history. In this setting, peaceful and far removed from the grimy life of pits and docks, they proposed to train men and women in making furniture and pottery, in weaving and printing. But they found that reconstructing outbuildings to house these crafts met with many delays. The idea of a craft centre faded, with one notable exception. What did happen was very different and very remarkable. Gregynog became a centre for the arts, for music, for poetry, and for the printing of fine books. Books produced by the Gregynog Press were examples of a marriage of art and craftsmanship rarely equalled by presses elsewhere. The very highest standards were set from the beginning, and the Gregynog books became highly valued and treasured by collectors.
It produced 42 titles in the something under 20 years that it was going, of which 7 were in Welsh, one was bilingual, and originally, most of them had to do with Wales and things Welsh, but by the end, they became really vehicles for illustrators or works by friends of the management, things that would produce fine books.
It has been said that, although the Davies sisters paid for it, the celebrated Gregynog Press owed its foundation and long existence in the years between the wars to a close friend and advisor, Dr. Thomas Jones. The authors, the editors, the illustrators for the Gregynog publications were drawn from among his circle of friends in the world of printing and literature, and his, too, were the contacts for the craftsmen to service the press. The first controller of the press was the architect and painter Robert Ashwin Maynard, and he was followed by Blair Hughes Stanton and by Agnes Miller Parker, both eminent in the art of engraving. It was always the aim to encourage talented people to help, and Dora Herbert Jones was early enlisted as secretary to the press. Over the years, she saw many artists come and go.
I think sometimes it's very hard on artists to have to live almost isolated here. The country's marvellous. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else and so on. But you don't get much help, you see. You know our old saying in Welsh, hairn a hog a hairn. It's only iron that can sharpen another iron. Well, there weren't many artistic irons in this district, I can tell you, for them to sharpen on. And they felt it, you know. And you get low. You can't produce all the time. Anyway, Blair Hugh Stanton and Agnes Miller Parker were the next people who came after Maynard and Braille. But, oh, how difficult it was to print Hugh Stanton. The hair-like fineness of his engraving. And was it quick? I never saw anything like it. Well, the printing, he had worked for the Golden Cockerel and these people. But I dare say you'll say this is partisan, and perhaps it is. But nobody has ever printed him as we did.
This illuminated Life of St. David is a good example of how the skills of a number of local people were put to use.
Village girls had been taught to colour all these by hand, every sheet.
I started here in June 1927. I left school at the age of 14, but Mr. Maynard came to the school and to ask if there was a child, available to come to, because my brother had been here 4 years before, you see. And so they decided, the schoolmaster and Mr. Maynard, that I should stay in school 6 months to polish up my Welsh, which I did, and with the view to coming into the compositing room, you see. But at the end of the 6 months, they had already printed the Life of St. David, and they wanted the little woodcuts painted that were on the pages. So that's what we did. There was 2 other girls beside myself, and we did that for a few weeks. So after that was finished, I went into the bindery, but I wasn't allowed to work on the books proper. I only had to work on dummies, you see, because, I mean, you make a mistake at the beginning and you can't rectify it at all, you see. So you have to, we worked on dummies right through every process, folding, sewing, rounding and backing, and all the forwarding parts, and then the covering. Later on, of course, that was only called covering books. Later on we came to the binding, which was a much greater job to do, really. And then we went on to several books during that year. Worked under Mr. Fisher, who was a real craftsman, really, and we were very privileged that we could work under such a craftsman, really. We didn't realize it at the time, but it was years afterwards that we realized what we were able to do.
As the Gregynog idea developed, so the household and outdoor staff grew in number, the cooks and maids, the chauffeurs and estate workers. They were particularly welcome if they could join the sisters in the house choir. A good voice was not essential, but it helped.
We were quite a small number in the early days, about 3 on each part, which should be 12, of course. Later it was extended, in the area was extended from where the choir was brought in. It went as far as Welsh Pool, finally, Newtown, even to Llanidlws. Actually, I was in the second tenor section, and I've a lot of very happy memories with the choir, both with the festivals that they held at every summer at Gregynog for a number of years.
Music at Gregynog was at first performed in the library of the house or in the drawing room, and there were summer occasions when it didn't rain, with al fresco concerts given in the gardens of the estate. But as interest and enthusiasm increased, so too did the need for a more suitable setting for musical performances. This concert hall was originally Lord Joyce's billiard room, but the green baize table gave place to a stage and a fine new organ, and instead of the clicking of billiard balls, the room echoed to the strain of Bach's Matthew Passion, the first musical work to be performed here in 1923. It was conducted by Walford Davies in a sol-fa edition as well as old notation. Sir Walford, as he later became, was much involved in the promotion and performances of the county festivals at Newtown. Of the man who became Master of the King's Music, Dora Herbert-Jones has declared, Walford was the music of this place, and everything that came in his style. With his enthusiasm and guidance, the sisters promoted 6 festivals of music and poetry at Gregynog between 1933 and 1938. To these gatherings came many of the musical figures of the day, like Adrian Boult, that champion of English music, and 2 great composers, Gustav Holst, who composed for the choir, and Ralph Vaughan Williams. And from the literary scene, there was the poet Lascelles Abercrombie, and that bearded iconoclast George Bernard Shaw. Again, T.J. was no doubt influential in attracting these visitors. As well as occasions for music and poetry, these days in the 1930s saw the holding of conferences of many kinds at Gregynog. The music room, lined with a fine art collection, then became a setting for conference, for argument and discussion.
It was a talking shop, and met in Gregynog in November each year throughout the 30s. Fairly high-powered conference for those days, and we talked. We'd meet on a Friday evening, get there Friday by train to Newtown Station, where a vehicle from Place Gregynog would be waiting for us and take us then the 6 miles or so to Gregynog. And there we would be secluded for a weekend and depart on Monday morning. Well, the atmosphere of the house itself was a bit enclosed. It was prim, extremely well behaved, because, of course, the ladies were such courteous people. But they would have been deeply shocked, I know, between the contrast, dramatic contrast, between, say, their early morning, the morning service on a Sunday morning, which concerned them so much and which meant so much to them, and which was the highlight of each conference. And then what happened in what I might call the upper room, one of the few rooms where smoking was allowed in the house, because they were so very much afraid of fire. And in this smoke-laden room of men drinking lemonade, because, of course, they were strict TTs, you had the filthiest stories told that I've ever heard in my life. And it was a shock to me, and I'm sure the ladies would have been shocked beyond words. They would have died of shock had they known of this contrast. But it was a relief from the rather prim, strict, religious, good feeling that existed in the house, and the good manners that persisted. And here were people seeking some kind of release from it. And that impression abides with me. It's no reflection upon the ladies, of course. It is a reflection upon humankind. What is man? Well, man is a very odd creature, and he behaves in odd ways. And that is a sidelight on the atmosphere of Gregynog that remains in my memory, where you had leaders of Welsh life, deacons, respectable people, unburdening themselves of a weight of guilt, or dredging into their innermost subconsciousness and dragging up perhaps something of the spirit of the trenches at a time in a conference that was devoted to peace on earth and goodwill among men. It was a very strange experience.
The gardens around the house were an especial pleasure for Gwen and Margaret, and the grounds of the estate were kept in meticulous order by a team of workers, led by the head gardener. He, as a young man, had been looking for work in Scotland before coming to Wales.
I went to Edinburgh to the Botanic Gardens, and asked if there was any vacancies, and they said they'd had a letter from a place in Wales called Gregynog. We weren't familiar with the Welsh pronunciations then, but anyway, I applied for this place. They said it was an interesting place. There was all sorts of plants growing, and there was scope for further development. And on the Sunday afternoon, I had an interview with Miss Gwen and Miss Margaret Davies, and also a Major Burton Evans, who did most of the talking. Miss Gwen said very little, and I can't remember Miss Daisy saying anything at all. But anyway, I got home, and in about a week or 10 days, I had a letter saying offering me the situation. They had two different interests. Miss Gwen was rather for the rarer plants, and of course Miss Daisy enjoyed the more common plants like Canterbury bells, pansies, cornflowers and stocks and asters and sweet peas and roses. These were her favourites, although she painted quite a lot of the other flowers besides.
Margaret Davies loved painting in the gardens, and the dell was created to be a place where her hobby could be indulged in seclusion. For this shy amateur artist, the dell became a bower for blissful solitude. But outside their quiet life at Gregynog, it was a strong social conscience that prompted the setting up of 2 rehabilitation centres for children who were victims of the Depression. One was in the north.
It was a convalescent home for the children of South Wales when tuberculosis was very, very prevalent. These children were chosen by the medical officers, and they were sent up to Llwyn to our medical staff. The children's ailments were mainly bronchitis, asthma, debility, undernourishment, and tuberculosis starting. They would have gone into tuberculosis without the fresh air and the good food. Miss Davies financed all this project, and she left it endowed for life. When they left us, they went back to their parents in South Wales, and every year Miss Davies arranged for these children to have a reunion in Boverton Girls' Camp, which was a camp built near Llantwich Major, facing the Bristol Channel, a beautiful camp with a dining room, a lovely entertainment hall, and these children would come then for a week.
In the 1940s, Mrs. Anita Arter was a frequent visitor at Boverton.
Miss Margaret Davies came to stay once a year at the holiday camp and had her own tent in which she slept. She was always very insistent that nothing in the life of the camp should be altered in any way because she was there. She just liked to observe, and she did observe a great deal, and took great pleasure in seeing the children at their activities. There were 50 girls there every week and 12 tired mothers, for whom, many of whom, it was their first holiday and only holiday. The life of the camp was full and busy, competitions, walks, Eisteddfodau, very well organized all through the week, so the time went very quickly. The youngsters, 50 girls, slept in tents, and every day started with prayers, and every Sunday evening a minister or a clergyman came out to take a service after supper for all the girls and the staff and the mothers. She was very shy and very gentle, very quiet, but one felt always that she set the standards that were maintained in Borden.
The coming of the war in 1939 meant an end to the arts of peace, and Gregynog became a Red Cross convalescent home. Before that happened, the press had been closed, much to Gwen's distress. "It won't be possible to open the press ever again. Don't give up our dream without a struggle," she wrote to her great friend Thomas Jones. "The first war knocked my life and health to pieces," she continued. "It had to be rebuilt, and you were the builder and restorer. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all you've given me and done for me. All I've been able to do during the last 30 years has been almost entirely your doing." Gwendolyn Davies died in 1951. Her sister Margaret continued to live at Gregynog, and music making there was resumed in 1954 with the help of 2 musicians from the university at Aberystwyth. One was Professor Ian Parrott, the other the organist Charles Clements, who'd played there often in the great days between the wars.
When I first went to Aberystwyth as Gregynog professor in 1950, I soon got to know both the sisters, but of course Gwendolyn died the next year, and I became much more involved with Margaret Davies. And I got to know Tom Jones, who was the great inspirer behind the early days, and he came as president of University College Aberystwyth and retired there, and he said to me, he said, "I'm so glad you've renewed the contact with Gregynog. You must keep it up." And so I did. And I got to know Margaret Davies very much better, and we arranged concerts. Various people were involved in the early days, and then in the mid-50s, we had a series of festivals in which we tried to recreate the same conditions that we'd had before. One of the things was Walford Davies is the Pied Piper. Now, he'd written this before the war, and then he died during the war, and it never got performed. It was dedicated to the Gregynog choir. And then, of course, one of the most distinguished of composers that I persuaded to go there was Sir Arthur Bliss. I got him onto a sort of whirlwind tour of Wales. Then I took him on to Gregynog, and that was the end of a very exciting round trip where he listened to the choir.
The link between the university and the Davies family was a strong one, forged by many years of friendship and joint endeavour. Margaret Davies wished to perpetuate that link, so in 1958 she suggested she would hand over Gregynog Hall, together with land and an endowment, to the University of Wales. She would remain at Gregynog as a tenant. And this she did until at the age of 79 she died there, as quietly as she and her sister had lived. The halcyon private days of Gregynog were over. Now it was the university's task to utilize it to advantage.
We looked in briefly to the question of the possibility of having somebody here to teach the fine arts full-time. For various reasons that wasn't possible, and a kind of compromise, which was a very happy one in the end, was that we established an arts fellowship for a period of at least 6 months every year, and we get financial assistance from the Welsh Arts Council. And the idea is that the artist should carry on with his or her own work and should be available to talk to students, informally very often, formally sometimes.
When I arrived here in January, I was beginning work on a music theatre work called The Crossing, a work for 4 performers and 7 instrumentalists, about 45 minutes long. And the time of the fellowship was just the right length of time to write the work from beginning to end. So it was completed a day before I left. And now, as it were, time has come full circle, and the work is being performed here where it was composed.
Artists in residence, like the Welsh composer John Metcalfe, have come here with their families to live on the estate. In the recent past, they've included the harpist Osian Ellis, the novelist Emyr Humphreys, the sculptor Jonna Jones, and more recently, this writer, Claire Morgan from Gwent. Surely the sisters would have warmly approved this new use of Gregynog as a retreat for artistic endeavour. These artists in residence are expected to mingle with the students attending courses at the hall, in social terms and more formally to lecture to them. Students now come to Gregynog from many colleges, and their courses include the sciences as well as the arts. This group, for example, are microbiologists in the making. In the handsomely panelled Blaney room, they can perhaps imbibe something of the tradition of this place. And talk and discussion can range from a critique of James Joyce to the screening of a film classic or a piano recital. But the biggest contrast with former days is the lack of any formality in dress and at table. The celebrated press has resumed production, and 2 full-time printers are engaged there. The tradition continues of bringing in specialists like bookbinders and engravers to produce such illustrated works as these. And apart from their content, these books are still art objects in themselves.
The binding here is in both calf and goat skin at the bottom here, with gold tooling and also gold lettering on the spine.
Mm-hmm. Have you got it as an onlay or an inlay on these?
The goat is laid over the calf
yes.
on the edge here, so it's slightly raised.
Yes.
They were both rather shy. They were very wealthy. They must have been, to command this large house and to extend it as they did as a conference centre. But I had an impression that the weight of wealth which they had inherited was a heavy burden upon them, and they were determined to justify to themselves and to Almighty God the possession of this great wealth. And their way of doing it was to do something for Wales.
The 2 sisters did many things for Wales, but nothing compares with their art collection, a bequest to the nation and to the world.
The international importance of the French 19th century paintings coming from the Davies collection is enormous. And we are constantly being asked for loans to the most important, prestigious exhibitions throughout the world. This places a great responsibility on us. It is very highly rated indeed. The paintings by Daumier are the most important group by far and away in the United Kingdom, and the same applies to the paintings by Jean-Francois Millet. Those paintings are probably one of the finest groups in the world. In fact, recently we had the Coup de Vent by Millet on loan in Tokyo, and a colleague of mine from the Louvre looked at this painting and said, "Monsieur, this is as fine as anything we have by Millet in the Louvre." And we do have great, great paintings in that collection. We have a great deal of difficulty in maintaining the right conditions for the collection. Of course, it's one of the great jewels of the museum.
Undoubtedly, it is this fine collection of French art that will most fittingly preserve the memory of the Davies sisters and their notable generosity. When Gwendolyn Davies died in 1951, those pictures she herself had purchased were donated to the museum. Margaret Davies died in 1963, when the bulk of her purchases joined her sisters to complete the bequest. As the late Rollo Charles wrote, they were art lovers, not connoisseurs. Vetting was left to the vets. Their selection was made by eye. But it was a shrewd eye, as this collection clearly shows. For them, it was the pleasure that these pictures gave that really mattered.